Okay, I hope that we are live here. Welcome to my very first attempt at a family history talk via the internet. This is something I have never ever tried before. I don't know how it's going to go, but you've got to try these things to see if they work. So here we go. Before I start, I thought maybe I should introduce myself a bit because I've never really bothered to do that. So, basically, I am a family history researcher. I live in East Lancashire in northwest England, in case any of you are overseas. But I got into history very, very early. I was always interested in history. I was into the ancient Egyptians, and I particularly love the Victorian period. And also, one thing that really sticks in my mind, which is completely relevant to what I'm going to talk about today, is a project that I did in my very last year of primary school. I, I don't know whether to tell you that that was 24 years ago, but it is, so make of that what you will regarding my age. It was 24 years ago. And one thing I really remember about that last term at school was that we did a project about not Britain since the 1930s, which we've been looking at all year, but instead we did a really quick project about the history of our school and the church next to it. And I haven't got the history exercise book that I had. I wish that I'd kept it. But that project always really stuck in my mind. And many, many years later, about 2011, 2012, I decided that I was going to try and become a family history researcher because everybody was saying, why don't you do it for other people? And I thought, we're going to give it a go, we're going to try. So that was how I started. And then I remembered this project that I'd done at school. And I suddenly started to think, well, if I am I know how to research other people now. I know where to look at things. I know to look at trade directories and census records and all those sort of things that you look at when you're researching family history. So can I use those resources? Can I use those skills to apply them to any information that I can find about the people that taught at my old school, and see whether I can find out a bit more about who those people were and what kind of lives they had and where they went after they worked at my old school. Did they stay there for their whole career? Did they not? So that was my original goal. And historical research, if you don't really you've never really got into it before, to be honest, it is a bit like Alice in Wonderland. You find something interesting, you start to follow it up, you go off on a complete tangent, and you never really know where it's going to lead. So, of course, this talk actually started out as something much more ambitious. This was going to be an entire talk all about all of the teachers who ever worked at my old primary school. But the trouble is that the records go back. The school was actually built about 1823, the original school, and it still exists as a school. It is still at the school now. So I quickly realised, 200 years in one talk is a bit ambitious. Narrow the field down a bit. And so this is really how I ended up starting to look into the teachers and just trying to map out their lives. And in doing so, I discovered the fascinating story of Letitia Burscough. And I'm just going to have a look. I'm not sure how I screen share on here, but let me just see if I can work it out. No, I can't work out how to screen share. So, nevertheless, we're going to carry on. So, basically, Clitheroe, where I grew up, where I live, is an old market town, and it is particularly famous. It's got its Norman castle, and just below that, quite a bit below that, there are two roads. There is Moor Lane, and then below Moor Lane, on the lower side of the hill, because it is really hilly up by the castle, is another street, Lowergate, which sort of makes sense. It is it literally, physically is lower than the road above it, so maybe that's why it's called Lowergate. And the name is found in old records as early as 1610, so it's been called Lowergate for a long time. It's probably even older than that. And there are 2 or 3 significant buildings on Lowergate. One is the Catholic Church, which the one that you can see today was built in 1850, and the next to that is the primary school. On the other side of that is what is now the social centre. But what is now the social centre, where the original building was, that was the original school. That is the school that was built in 1823. And I went to many school disco, as you do, at that parish social centre. I even had confirmation classes in there. Catholic school, makes total sense. And there are actually some clues about the history of the school that you can find just by going through the, strangely enough, the parish records. You wouldn't expect that. So I'm going to tell you a bit about, I'm going to read you an extract from the very beginning of the parish records, which tells us, in November 1797, a temporary chapel, 4 yards and 8 inches square, so really tiny that, was hired in Clitheroe. It was an outbuilding annexed to the last house of the row where the present chapel stands. The new chapel of Clitheroe is dedicated to St. John the Evangelist. Again, that would be right, because the modern church is St. Michael and St. John the Evangelist. So, yeah. The first stone was laid on the 16th of July, 1798, on which day is celebrated the feast of Our Blessed Lady of Mount Carmel. The chapel was opened on the 18th of November, 1798. The school adjoining the chapel was begun in July 1823. The first stone was laid on the 9th of July. And the Catholic chapel was actually, wasn't a standalone. Nobody actually just turned up in Clitheroe and decided we're going to build a Catholic chapel. What actually happened was that the Jesuits got thrown out of France at the time of the end of the French Revolution, 1794. They ended up at Stonyhurst College, which is like about 5 or 6 miles from Clitheroe. It's outside Clitheroe in a rural area. So from Stonyhurst, which is in the middle of nowhere, they sent out Father John Lawrenson, a priest who was actually originally from Essex. He came out on horseback, apparently, to go to Clitheroe to say mass, and the original congregation was tiny. There was something like 12 people. It was really not a big congregation, but it was a start. So we know from the parish registers to the month when the school chapel was built, and we also know that from an 1854 trade directory, a little more information about, I beg your pardon, it is not a trade directory, it is the Clitheroe Advertiser from about 1900, when the church was having its 50th anniversary, and they did a bit of a retrospective about the school and its origins and the church and its origins. And they tell us that in about the year 1854, the Reverend Father Bird enlarged the day school by throwing open the old chapel and a cottage into one large room and adding a class to the side of it. So we're getting a good idea now of what the school would have looked like in the 1860s, which is going to be completely relevant to the story of Letitia Burscough. So we really ought to move on to Letitia. Because it was her name came up. It was just a list of teachers that I was given by one of my old teachers, and that was what I used to try and map out all these the stories behind these names, find out who they were, where they were from. I thought they were all from Clitheroe. They were not all from Clitheroe. Some of them were from London, some of them were from Wales. They were coming. Some of them were from Scotland. Quite a lot were from Ireland, which makes sense. The Irish immigrants after the potato famine. It was that kind of time. So you get a whole. Teachers did not just have one job and stay there for the whole of their career in the early Victorian to mid-Victorian period. A lot of the time they were moving. It could be every 18 months, it could be every 3 months. They might only be there for a term. So they weren't doing the thing that a lot of the teachers I knew did, where they basically stayed in one job for the whole of their career. It was completely different in the Victorian period, which makes it both more interesting and more frustrating to do the research. But in doing this research, I saw this name, Letitia Burke, and Letitia Burscough appear, and I originally thought it's a mistranslation. It's obviously it's the same person. It's just somebody can't read somebody's writing. Well, yes and no. There's a story behind this. This is the story that I'm going to tell you. And if you have ever, many of you won't have done, but some of you may have sat through the other talks that I have done. And if you have done that, or if you have seen any of my other YouTube videos, you will know that I'm really, really interested in researching Catholic history. And as with my Hearsts, I have exactly the same trouble with my Hearsts. I can only get the Burscough family's line back to the early 1700s, the early 1740s. It turns out that her family actually came from Walton-le-Dale, which is literally just outside Preston in Lancashire. So this is starting to give you a good idea of the kind of place that we're looking at. And so, of course, I went to the Lancashire archives and I had a look at my go-to resource, which is the Return of Papists for 1767. It covers the whole diocese of Chester, which is not just Cheshire, the county. It covers an awful lot of Lancashire. It covers Liverpool, because Merseyside didn't exist, that kind of thing. It goes all the way to the Yorkshire border almost. And they are a wonderful resource if you are researching Catholics, because that was the point in time when people were not really supposed to be Catholic. So you had to, essentially, if you wanted to be Catholic, you were then risking being fined and accused of recusancy. And you just weren't towing the line, because the official religion of England at the time was still very much the Church of England. So they made this, what is effectively a census of Catholic people in 1767. And there were a few people called Burscough or Boscoe, that is spelt Boscow, just as the place in West Lancashire is sometimes interpreted. There were quite a few of these people in Walton-le-Dale. And using the Catholic registers for Brindle and also Brownedge, which again is in the Preston area, it's near Bamber Bridge, I managed to work out, the family line down from Letitia. I worked out that it begins basically with a Richard Burscough and Ellen or Helena Baldwin. They had a William, and he marries a Mary Council. They have a Peter Bosco or Burscough. He's born in Cuerden Green in near Preston again. He ends up marrying a girl from Garstang. He marries Alice Smith in Garstang, and they have a whole load of children at Clitheroe near Lancaster. The youngest child being Peter, who's born in 1814. And it was Peter that then somehow got himself he was a draper by trade, and somehow he got himself to Burnley by the age of 20, and there he married a girl called Sarah Massey, who was 21, the same as he was. She was originally from Chorley, but her family had moved to Habergam Eaves, which is not too far from Burnley. It's within Burnley, essentially. And so they get married in 1834, and they begin to have children. They have William in 1836, James 1838, Jane 1840, Letitia, or Lettice, as she's sometimes spelt, was born in Habergam Eaves in 1842. Then there was Thomas, 1844, Alice, 1847. We'll come back to Alice later. Gilbert Bernard, who was born and died in 1849, and finally John, who was born in 1851. So they had 8 children in all. And then using an excellent resource I highly recommend for any of you looking for Lancashire ancestors, is have a look for the Lancashire Online Parish Clerk's website. It is completely free, it is volunteer run, and they transcribe parish registers, and it's quite easy to search. And there weren't so many Catholic ones when it first went online, but now there are all kinds of Catholic ones. There are Methodist and Presbyterian, all sorts of different records pertaining to churches, including ones from St Mary the Assumption, the Catholic Church in Burnley. And it was there through that website that I found the baptism of a child called Letitia Burscough, daughter of Peter Bosco and Sarah Massey. She was born on the 27th of August 1842. She was baptised on the 18th of September, and her godparents are James Shields and Lettice Massey. Lettice Massey must be her mother's sister, and she was also, obviously, she's been named after her auntie. And then there's the Lancashire BMD indexes, which again are another free resource, volunteer transcribed, and that threw up Letticie's birth certificate index registration, not the birth certificate itself, but an indexed record of the registration. And that was spelt again in a completely different way. She's been baptised as Bosco. She was registered at birth as Burscough, that is Bourrscough, and again as Lettice, not Letitia. So it's quite interesting to see how these names evolve, because everybody, I mean, my first name is not actually Kate, it's a longer version of Kate, but the Kate is the name that I go by, so you would never know to look for me unless you knew that. And so it's obviously, this kind of thing was happening just the same 150 years ago. And so by 1851, this is the first census that is taken after Letitia is born. She shows up living at Spring Gardens in New Accrington in Lancashire with her mum and dad, Sarah and Peter, and brothers and sisters, William, James, Jane, Thomas, and Alice. Lettice and Thomas, Jane, and James are all still at school. They're all aged 6 to 12. The eldest son, William, is a dyer of calico, so he's already left school at 15, which is completely normal for that time. And then we move on again to 1861, and we see that now they are still they're still in roughly the same area, but they moved to number 96 Blackburn Road. And Peter again he's still working as a draper, Letitia's dad. Brother William is a cotton manufacturer. Letitia herself is now a school pupil teacher. So she's a pupil teacher is like generally they were a very bright, able scholar who at the sort of 12 or 13, rather than have to leave school and go out to earn a living, they would get chosen effectively to be trained up to become a teacher. And it was usually like a 5-year apprenticeship. It was usually done often in the school where you were educated. Sometimes you might actually go to another school, but that would be your apprenticeship, about 5 years. So 1861, Letitia is 18 years old, so she's probably coming to the end of her pupil teacher apprenticeship. So there she is, she's just 18 years old. She really is a proper grown-up now. She's about to go into the world of work. And then, of course, the next census doesn't come out until 1871. But meanwhile, there are lots and lots of other records that you can use to trace your family. In the interim period, you can trace anybody in this period, and one of the great things you can use is a trade directory, because they are, if you've never seen them, they are like doorstops. They're these huge, thick books that they can be 1,000 pages, 1,200 pages. And they're basically the yellow pages of their day, but without phone numbers. But with the extra added advantage that our modern phone directories do not include a little paragraph of history about things that went on in a particular town. This was completely standard in a trade directory. But it's in trade directories that you find all this sort of information about what schools there were, what churches there were, public buildings, and often you will also find that, as well as the schools being listed with the names of their teachers, you will then find those teachers listed separately in alphabetical order, and there it will say what their profession was. And that's why if you look at Kelly's Post Office Directory of Lancashire for 1864, under Accrington, you find 2 members of the Burscough family. You find Peter, Letitia's dad. He's a linen draper at 96 Blackburn Road, so that's correct. We know they were there in the 1861 census. And just above him is listed Burscough Letitia, Miss, Day School. So she is running a day school. And the following year, 1865, Slater's Directory of Lancashire is published. It includes Accrington, and once more it mentions Letitia, and it says that she's living at 96 Blackburn Road. So I think at this point in her early career, she may well have been operating a school from one room basically in her own home. I think that's how a lot of people did work at that time. But now I think we should move on a couple of years, because there was something that really interesting, if you can call it interesting, happened to Letitia in 1867, and Being from Clitheroe, only live a few miles from Accrington, and when I uncovered this story, I was absolutely amazed that I had never heard this story before. I had no idea about it. I had no idea that this happened to, this was an experience that happened to somebody who went on to teach at my old school. I didn't even know this girl taught at my old school. But this is one of those times when you find out what wonderful resources newspapers are as far as historical research goes. We are way beyond births and marriages and deaths and censuses and baptisms now. This is the meat of the research. This is where you find out what happened to people, and there is nothing better for that than a Victorian newspaper. So I will paint a picture by reading this extract from the Liverpool Mercury of the 4th of March 1867. This tells us, just beyond the Accrington station, the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway runs along a viaduct, which is composed of a number of more than usually lofty arches. They're the railway arches. Beneath one of these arches there was last summer erected for Mr. James Duckworth a brick building, in which, since it is principally composed of worsted, which is knitted by machinery and after varnished, worsted is a textile. As we are informed, this varnish should be used in a heated state. It will be apparent that the process of manufacture was attended with great risk. Of course it is, if you're going to use varnish that must be heated. And it is stated not long ago that a fire broke out at Mr. Duckworth's premises, but it did not do much damage. I bet you're very relieved about that. I hope you're relieved, because the next time a fire broke out in Mr. Duckworth's premises, something truly awful happened. The Liverpool Mercury then goes on to tell us a bit more. It describes this building, so we get quite a good picture of it. It's about 30 feet long, and 14 or 16 feet wide. It is 2 stories in height and was well lighted, there being 9 windows and a doorway on the ground floor, and 10 windows on the upper one. The one doorway, now if any of you have ever had to work anywhere where you needed to know where the emergency exits are, you will, and even if you haven't, you will understand why this already begins to sound dangerous. The one doorway was the sole means of entering. Within the building was a small flight of stairs which led to an upper floor. So if anything happens in this building, there is only one way out, and that is for the people that are upstairs as well as the people that are downstairs. Eventually, the upper story was let to Miss Burscough, who at the time conducted an infant school in Edgar Street, only a few paces distant. So Letitia has moved her little infant school, obviously from Blackburn Road, and then to Edgar Street, and then to this place under the railway arches, and she probably thinks it's a decent opportunity to keep her little school going. In the Illustrated London News of the 16th of March 1867, you can actually find a picture of this schoolhouse. It's shown with a little crowd standing around it, and it is shown to be taking up the whole of the width of one of the spaces underneath the railway arches. So you're probably at this point wondering why, if you can't already guess why, there is quite a lot in the newspapers in the spring of 1867 about this little building in Accrington. Why is it possibly going to be interesting? It's going to be interesting for all the wrong reasons. So here, Letitia takes up the story herself, because the Illustrated London News, to lead into this story, actually printed that picture I told you about with the caption, "Schoolhouse at Accrington, where 9 children were burnt to death." So you know what's going to happen now, don't you? You knew what was going to happen a few minutes ago. This is the story of the fire. Letitia actually was quoted in quite a lot of newspapers reported on this horrendous tragedy. Of course, there was an inquest into it, and it was reported. It wasn't just reported in the Lancashire papers. It was reported all across the country. It was even by May, it had made it into the Tasmanian Mercury on the other side of the world. This little school in Accrington ends up in the papers in Tasmania. That is how far this information spread. And if you're wondering, I found the Tasmanian Mercury record on the absolutely excellent Trove website, which is run by one of the Australian government sites. And it has got a whole host of free to access, searchable newspapers published in, I think there's all the territories in Australia. I'm not sure if New Zealand's in. Tasmania definitely is. But it doesn't just cover Australian news, as you're going to see. It covers news that was passed on from England as well, even if it did take weeks to get there. But to go back to the Bury Times, let us see what Letitia herself had to tell us. I ran down the stairs and called upon the children to follow me. It was coming up through the floor, the smoke, and it looked to be thicker at the top of the steps than below. I took the children with me. I got hold of them in my arms. They held me. I ran out with as many as I could. The door at the bottom of the stairs was closed, and I ran against it with my head. I called upon all of them to follow me. All was dark. The upper room was full in a few moments before I got back again. I did not get to the top every time. Now, it's worth remembering at this point, this is the 10th of May, 1867, and it's really easy to forget now that we're already becoming absorbed in this story. It's really easy to forget. Letitia Burscough was 24 years old at this time. Her 25th birthday was going to be in the September, like 4 months away. She's 24 years old, and she's rescuing her she's got 60 or 80 children, I think she had in that class that day, and she's trying to get them out of the building because it's on fire. I mean, that is heroism on another level. The Tasmanian Mercury then continues. After Miss Burscough had given an alarm, she ran back to the schoolroom and got out several of the children, as we've seen. While continuing her courageous labours in this respect, the wooden staircase, having been burnt through in one part, fell, and the remaining children were for a time cut off from all assistance. An indescribable scene as confused as agonising ensued. The imprisoned little children were uttering the most pitiable cries, some of them huddled together near the desk of the mistress, several screaming at the top of the broken staircase, which was being rapidly destroyed by the extending flames. Many of them were standing near the windows, imploring help, and nearly all of them were crying for their fathers and mothers to come and save them. I mean, of course they were. They were babies. It's not often that newspapers move me, but my God, that moves me. And fortunately for those little kids, there was help at hand. Obviously, people must have been on the street. There were people on the street. We're going to find that out in a minute. But one person in particular was coming down the street. A young policeman by the name of Richard Burton, who was then married with a family of his own. was just going down the road. And although a policeman and not a fireman, he managed to break into that schoolroom, and there the story picks up again from the Tasmanian Mercury. He shouted out to ascertain where the children were, and on hearing someone shriek, "Oh, we are here," he groped about, because I suppose he had no breathing apparatus, he had no goggles or anything like that, and eventually met with a child, which he lifted into his arms and carried to the nearest window. Having dropped the child through the window, I suppose that's what he had to do, into the arms of some of those people who had congregated in the street below. Burton resumed his search in the room, again, I suppose, not being able to see anything, met with more children, and put 4 of them through the window in the same manner as the first one. I think that is ingenious. That is absolutely ingenious. And I am pleased to say that Constable Richard Burton was rewarded for his heroism. On the 9th of March 1867, just a few days after this happened, the Burnley Gazette said that the Chief Constable of Lancashire granted Constable Richard Burton a badge of merit and a financial bonus for his heroic and praiseworthy conduct. So if you are related to Constable Richard Burton, then you should be proud of him. You really should. He was a hero. But as you'll appreciate, there were some this was an infant school. In fact, there were some children in this school who were of nursery age. And as you can imagine, as we have seen from that picture in the Illustrated London News, there were some tragedies as well. And fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, the names of the children who perished were printed in the newspapers. So we do actually know who they are, and I'm glad that we know who they are. They were Mary Bentley, aged 3 years and 9 months, Mary Alice Duckworth, aged 5 years and 6 days, Mary Hannah Fisher, 3 years 4 months, Thomas Jackson, 3.5 years, Catherine Lanty, 7 years 11 months, Robert Loud, 4 years 3 months, Louisa Proctor, 5 years, Ellen Ann Varley, 5 years and 5 weeks, Elizabeth Jane Wade, 6 years and 4 days. You can see these are very little children. They are sort of 3 years 4 months to nearly 8. They are babies. They are infant school age. They had no chance of saving themselves. I'm amazed that the others who would have been of a similar age, they managed to get out. But I draw your attention particularly here to Mary Alice Duckworth, because the saddest thing about her death is that her father James owned the knitting workshop below, where the varnish had set on fire, and which was the reason that the flames spread upstairs, filled the room with smoke, and basically set the building ablaze. So heaven only knows what he felt about that afterwards. I can only guess that Letitia was just as traumatised, because to the best of my knowledge, she'd never operated her own school again. From doing a little bit of background research, in case those names are in any way familiar to you, I can tell you that some of them were buried locally. The fire happened on the 2nd of March, I think it was. By the 3rd, Catherine Lanty and Robert Loud were buried at St Mary's Church at Clayton-le-Moors. The following day, 4th of March, Elizabeth Jane Wade, aged 6, the daughter of John Wade, was buried at St Bartholomew's in Great Harwood. And on the same day, Mary Bentley, the daughter of Nicholas and Caroline, who was 3 years 9 months, was buried at All Saints at Clayton-le-Moors. I haven't been able to find out where the other children were buried, but I'm sure that it was close by. But now I think we should move on from that horrible incident and see what happened to Letitia next. As far as I am aware, she never operated her own school again. But 2 years later, aged 24, on the 5th of April 1869, the school logbook tells us that Burscough L commences her duties as an assistant mistress. This was 2 years and 2 days after a Catherine Burns had taken charge of the girls' school. So Miss Burns is the senior teacher and Letitia is her assistant. Because at this point in time, the girls and the boys at the Catholic school in Clitheroe, which is what I'm talking about here, are taught in separate classes, which was quite standard in those times. So here she is in Clitheroe now. She is teaching at the forerunner of my old school. It was a new start for Letitia, and she wasn't in Clitheroe all that long, really, probably about 2 years at the most. But it changed her life, and for the better. Because 21 months after Letitia arrives at Clitheroe, a young male teacher arrived at the boys' school. His name was John Burke, and he made a big impression on Letitia. So it's as well to be asking, I suppose, who is this man? Who is this John Burke? The censuses are a bit confusing. He was either born in Ireland or St Helens, Lancashire, in about 1849. I'm guessing, therefore, probably he was the child of Irish immigrants, and so he just wasn't sure where he was born. He later would identify his father as Edward Burke, a chemist, but I can find no man of that description living in St Helens in either 1851 or 1861, which is why I think that he was probably an immigrant. So I thought, well, if there's a chance he was born in Ireland, maybe I ought to look at Irish records. So I did. And I found a couple of possibilities. There's a John Burke who was baptised at St James's Roman Catholic Church in Dublin on the 16th of May 1849. His parents are Edward Burke and Eliza Kelly. But there's also a John Burke baptised in 1847 at Rathfarnham, which is just outside Dublin, and he was the son of Edward and Mary Burke. So either of these are a possibility, but I'm not 100% sure which is which. So, what sort of teacher is this John Burke? Well, he arrived in Clitheroe quite early it was like New Year of 1870, and he arrived to take the place of the previous boys' teacher, a Mr. James Barrett, who was not destined to be a teacher. He actually went off to ended up becoming a Catholic apostolic minister in somewhere in the southwest, I think. So he wasn't cut out for the teaching profession. I think some people are born to be teachers and some people are not. James Barrett was not born to be a teacher. A sample of one of his many barbed comments from the school logbook here. On the 22nd of November, just a few weeks before he goes, he said, "I find my monitor almost useless," his helper teacher, "and therefore I am striving to get another to fill his place. He has been working only 4 or 5 weeks. Poor little soul, honestly." He was probably about 12 or 14 years old, that monitor, and you just think, give him a chance, please. So James Barrett leaves Clitheroe. I think the line he actually finally wrote in the logbook was something like, "I am finally giving up the office of teacher at this school." You could see him almost cartwheeling out of the place. He didn't like it. He just didn't like it. And then John Burke comes, and John Burke is 10 years younger than James Barrett, and he is young. He's about 20, 21. He's young, he's enthusiastic, he's keen. And one of the first things he puts in the logbook is, I think that if parts of the partition were painted, there were two classrooms, boys and girls, and they were separated by a partition. If the partitions were painted, they would make good blackboards. He's coming in, he's doing DIY. So he's a young, dynamic teacher here. I like him. Now, Letitia and John, therefore, are teaching at Clitheroe quite a good time. One thing that happened in the 1870 was the Education Act, which meant that all children that were aged 5 to 10 were supposed to be given a place at school. It's what is the name of them? It's gone out of my head now. But there was Foster's Education Act. William Edward Foster, who I think may have been the MP for Bradford or somewhere like that. I think there's a statue to him, or a square named in his honour in Bradford. And so that was the point where they made these leaps towards trying to get proper education for children. So for those of you that don't never liked going to school, it's William Foster's fault. And at the same time, things were going on in Clitheroe that were quite interesting. In 1870, the parish priest, Richard Cardwell, to quote the Preston Guardian of around about August 1900, Father Cardwell built the large new schoolroom adjoining the old chapel of St. John the Evangelist, and with it 2 new classrooms, so they were extending the school. And in 1895, long after Letitia and John Burke were working there was a new infant school added 1895 at a cost of £80,000, which I think is something like £72,000 in today's money, something. So it was quite an expensive project. An investment. Now, last year, when I think it was last year, when the Heritage Open Days were going on, which unfortunately don't seem to be a thing this year because of the pandemic, but maybe there will be virtual stuff going on instead. St. Michael and St. John's Church, which is the church next to the school where I was educated, was taking part in the Heritage Open Day scheme. And so I thought, well, I'll go in and see what they've got up, and then put up all these displays of historical documents and extracts from all kinds of records, and there was a page of accounts relating to the year 1870, because that was the year when all this building work was going on at the school. And one thing that I did notice was that they were buying all sorts of furniture and things. On September the 23rd, 1870, a purchase was made of a desk and a table for the schoolmistress. So that would be either Letitia Burscough, or it could have been Catherine Burns, who I think was still working there at that time. But quite honestly, at the end of September 1870, I think Letitia had other things on her mind. How do I know this? Well, I did a bit of digging up on the internet. I went on the General Records Office and I ordered a marriage certificate. And so I can tell you that on the 4th of October, John Burke, Letitia's colleague, lived at 35 Lowergate, which is a little bit further down the road from the school and the church and the social centre, which used to be the school building. 35 Lowergate is actually pretty much next door to what was the job centre, if you know Clitheroe at all. And Letitia lived at an unspecified address on Lowergate. But the census wasn't taken till spring of 1871, so how do I know where they were on the 4th of October? Well, it's because that was the day that John Burke went for a little walk up the road to St Michael and St John's Church, and there he met Letitia, and he met the parish priest, Father Richard Cardwell, and Father Cardwell married them in the presence of Letitia's brother James and sister Alice. And on the marriage certificate, both of them confirmed that they were teachers. He said he was a schoolmaster. She said she was a schoolmistress. So clearly she had not given up her job on marriage. How very, very modern. And then from there, the next interesting bit comes in the girls' school logbook when they made that I was able to find. When it says that on the 15th of March, which again is like 2 weeks, I think, before the census was taken, it says that the new mistress was now Miss Olivia Cockshott. So the other one, Catherine Burns, had obviously moved on, and had been replaced with Olivia Cockshott, who was another local girl. She was from near Hurst Green, I think, which is just outside, actually just near Stonyhurst. So it's all tying up nicely together. And her assistant is Mrs. L. Burke. So Letitia, a married woman, has carried on working. Again, how very, very modern. Now, sometimes you can't find people on the census. Well, not in Letitia's case in 1871, because I'm very, very puzzled by Letitia in 1871, simply because she appears twice. She comes up once at Boardlands in Clitheroe, where she is she's 25 years old, she's a schoolmistress, she's born in Burnley, and she's boarding with a widowed lady, Hannah Watson, who's 68 and is a farmer of 10 acres of land. So she's at Boardlands, which is actually not really that near the school, but it's within walking distance. But meanwhile, Letitia popped up again, because she also seems to have been living at number 1 Penston Place in Bristol in Gloucestershire, because that is where her husband was living, John Burke, who was 22 years old. He was a schoolmaster from St Helens, so he thinks he's from St Helens now. And with him, he says, is his wife, Letitia Burke, who's 25 again, schoolmistress again, born in Burnley again. So, what is going on there? I don't know whether Letitia was still in Clitheroe, and I think Easter fell just after the census was taken. So, I don't know whether Letitia was actually still in Clitheroe because she was just coming to the end of the term and was about to go to Bristol to join John, or whether it was a case of she'd actually left on that, I think it was that Sunday when the census was taken, unless she left on the Monday to go to Bristol, and he wrote her down because he was expecting her to be there soon because she was his wife, and Hannah Watson wrote her down because she'd slept at that place in Borderlands the night before. I really don't know what the answer to that is, but Letitia has the distinction of being on the census twice. Now, I don't know how long Letitia and John stayed in Bristol, but I did find an interesting extract from the Catholic newspaper, The Tablet, dated the 9th of September 1871. So this again is only 5 months after the census is taken. And it says, wanted immediately, a certificated master teacher, to teach at the boys' school at the primary schools at Haverstock Hill in London. Address letters to the manager, St Dominic's Priory, Haverstock Hill, London. So, maybe John Burke, good Catholic teacher that he was, saw this advert in the tablet, and maybe that is why they appear to have moved there at some point before their eldest daughter Helena was born in 1873. Helena Burke, according to the 1881 census, was born 3 years after Letitia and John got married at Haverstock Hill. A year later, Alice was born at Hornsey Rise. Mary Letitia was born 1878 at Haverstock Hill again, and then Catherine was born in 1880 in Southwark. So they are clearly in the London area by this time. Now, I mentioned before, when I was at school, it was totally normal that many of the teachers would stay in one job for 20 years or more. I can remember one teacher retiring when I was at primary school, and I can remember there was one class actually had 3 teachers while I was there, just because the one teacher had retired, somebody came in as a temporary teacher, and a new teacher was appointed the year after I was in her class. So one class had 3 teachers, but apart from that, everything was pretty much constant. Reception class was one teacher's class, year 2 was another teacher's class, and so on and so on and so on. But in the Victorian period, clearly teachers were a lot more mobile. They often just did 18 months a year, 2 years maybe in one job, and then they moved on. So the census is showing that Letitia and John were in North London between 1873 and 1878. Then they moved to Southwark, which is on the south bank of the Thames, in time for their daughter Catherine to be born in 1880. And they lived in Munton Road, which is near the Elephant and Castle, which, according to the Ordnance Survey maps, is a short distance from several different schools. So I really don't know which one John was employed at, but I do know that he was a teacher still in 1881. By 1891, however, the census showed that Letitia was widowed and had moved to Dartford with 3 of her daughters. Of those, Helena and Alice were working as chemistry assistants in a wholesale chemical works, which sounds like it could be potentially dangerous. How Letitia felt about that, given that she'd lived through that fire in Accrington, I cannot tell you, but maybe it was the only thing that they could get work doing. Clearly, none of them ever went into teaching. In fact, they also had 2 female lodgers in the house in 1891, and they were also employed at this chemical works. So I can see why Letitia would have given up teaching herself, because she was a married mother with 4 children. So it would be unusual for a married mother to be working in the Victorian period. Now, my sense of geography is absolutely shocking, and one place I am really not familiar with the layout of is the great city of London. But I did manage to find a record from Bermondsey Workhouse. Dartford, where the Burkes were living, is about 10 miles east of Bermondsey, but both of them are on the south side of the Thames, so maybe, just maybe, the reason why Letitia was widowed in 1891 is because something to do with the fact that a 42-year-old John Burke appears in the death register for Bermondsey Workhouse on the 2nd of March 1890, which is a year before the census is taken. And I thought, well, why is he died in the workhouse, I wondered. And then I considered it a bit further, and I thought, of course, there was no National Health Service. You had to pay if you wanted a doctor. And maybe if John had been ill for a while, he couldn't actually afford to pay for a doctor. Maybe he didn't have any savings. I'm not saying they were particularly poor, but perhaps they just didn't have enough to put by to keep themselves going. But if that was the case, um, it's just possible that he would have been able to get free treatment at the infirmary ward of the local workhouse without having to suffer the social stigma of being admitted as a patient. Life is so much better with tea. But Letitia would survive her husband by about 36 years. And she ended up moving to 104 West Street in Erith, Kent by 1911. And the census then shows that she was living in a 6-room house with her daughter Mary Letitia, who was then married to a Horace Beckley, a hairdresser. And there was also their children. What have we got there? Just trying to read it. At the time, there was Edwin, Evelyn, and Marion, and there had been another child born. So, she's living with her grandchildren now. And from what I can make out, Letitia actually lived until the year 1926, the year that our present Queen was born, and she died in the Kent area, aged 84. So she had a fantastically long life. And I thought that was the end of the story. But it turns out there's a little bit of a twist in this. I thought this was going to be a tale of a teacher, and then it became a tale of a teacher who married a teacher. But what we need to do now is to go back to that detail. Letitia was a teacher who married a teacher. And when she married John Burke, there were 2 witnesses to the ceremony. One of them was her brother James, and the other was her sister Alice. And 4 years after Letitia and John got married, in 1874, Alice married a schoolmaster from Burnley called Thomas Marquis. And they were still married in 1911. Thomas Marquis was retired, but he carried on giving private tuition. And like Letitia, her sister Alice also lived to be 84 years old. So they've got good long lives in this family. Alice died in 1931, as far as I can make out. But Alice and Thomas Marquis had 6 children. And of those 6 children, their daughters Alice and Mary became certificated assistant teachers. They were employed by the local borough council because by this point in time, 1911, that was how things worked. Teachers were employed by the council. And also by 1911, Letitia's brother James, her elder brother James, who was now like 73 years old, was also living. He was still in Burnley. I think he was anyway. He was definitely in the East Lancashire area, and he was living with his daughter and also 2 granddaughters. And one of these granddaughters, Annie Claire Burscough, was 22 years old, and she was a teacher at the convent school in Burnley. So it turns out, just from doing a bit of research into my school, I end up stumbling on this fascinating story of a teacher who saved the lives of a good many children in a fire, and who was also connected to 5 other teachers. So there are connections absolutely everywhere to be found. Now, I hope that this is something I have never ever tried before. So if you are still here and you are still listening, then thank you very much for sticking with it. this is a whole new experience, isn't it? This wonderful world of being able to give talks and things live from your own house. So, who knows? I might have another go at it because it's quite good fun, really, and it gives you something to do on a quiet afternoon. Um, I haven't seen that there are any questions coming up, but however, if there are any questions that anybody thinks of when they come across this stream, then please feel free to leave me a comment, or please do get in touch some other way. What I would particularly like to know, though, if you are from the Burnley area or the Accrington area, if you have got links to the Burnley or Accrington area, is I have experimentally been trying to trace the descendants of Letitia Burscough and John Burke, and also Letitia's nephews and nieces that were born to her brothers and sisters. And I would really like to know whether there are any descendants of any of the Burscoughs out there, because I want to know whether they know about how incredible Letitia was just doing what she did, and on that, what must have been that really scary day in March of 1867, which must have started out as an ordinary working day for her. So, thank you for listening. We will hopefully maybe try this again sometime. So, until we do, then hope you enjoy it.